So there are others still joining. I think we'll begin in 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Can I just say right now, thank you very much for these questions.
Yes, thank you so much.
They're fantastic, and they've kept me up for the past few days. They're complicated questions, Asijit.
Your book has kept me up for 7 days. So,
you know, what I'm very happy about is that I know now for certain that there's at least one person in the world who has read this book. Because I have no evidence of this being true otherwise.
No, but you should be on social media because people do discuss your book there.
Do they?
Oh,
Yeah,
yes.
I am on Twitter, but in a cryptic, disguised way. I don't want my name out there, so I have a code name where I sort of lurk and I follow certain discussions of certain things. But I don't know. I'm deeply suspicious of social media generally, and as you know, as we spoke about this, sort of allergic to the idea of my image being out there. But I'm clearly attempting to get over this morning or this evening.
Also, I found the reference of the book in Mark Byron's book,
yeah.
The Geological Imagination. He refers to your book actually there.
Yeah, no, I came across that video after your invitation to do this. I tracked down his own video of, I think it's on YouTube, of your discussion, yes. Which I found very interesting. And then I tracked down his book because it also sounds fascinating. And I think it's arrived or it's coming soon. But if I understand it correctly, it's a relatively brief book.
Yes, it's 80 pages. It's just 80 pages. And Mark Byron has just joined. Mark Byron has just joined.
Ah, okay. Hello,
yeah.
Mark.
Yeah, Mark Byron has just joined. Hi, Mark. I think Professor Boulter is saying hi.
I don't know if I can actually see anyone.
I think his video is on mute. Let me ask him to. And it's 1:30 a.m. in Australia now, so he's wide awake.
Wow, that is dedication. Dedication.
Oh, Mark is saying hi. Yeah.
Hello, Mark.
Hi, how you doing? Hi, Jonathan. How are you?
I am well. Thank you for coming. I didn't expect
that's fine. I don't know how I'll go in terms of asking any intelligent questions, but I'm happy to sit here and listen to the two of you.
I'm happy not to have questions. Any tough ones?
Okay, Professor Boulter, should we begin? I think we should begin.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. So let people join, yeah. So our special guest today is Professor Jonathan Boulter. Good morning, Professor Boulter. It's 9:30 a.m., I suppose, there in Canada. And yeah, and good morning and good evening to everyone attending this discussion from different parts of the world. So Jonathan Boulter is a professor of English at Western University. He's the author of Posthuman Space in Samuel Beckett's short prose, which we'll be discussing today. Parables of the Posthuman came out in 2015, Melancholy and the Archive, Trauma, Memory and History in the Contemporary Novel, 2011, Beckett, A Guide for the Perplexed, which I extensively used in my PhD also, in 2008, Interpreting Narrative in the Novels of Samuel Beckett in 2001, and he is also the co-editor of Cultural Subjects, a Cultural Studies Reader, 2005. His work has appeared in Cultural Critique, Modern Fiction Studies, Genre Hispanic Review, Samuel Beckett Today, Journal of Beckett Studies, International Ford Maddox Ford Studies, as well as in Digital Gameplay, Essays on the Nexus of Game and Gamer, 2005. Sidewalks, Memories of the Posthuman in the work of Jorge Luis Borges, 2009. Samuel Beckett History, Memory Archive, 2009. Beyond Cyberpunk, 2010. Samuel Beckett and Pain, 2012. Understanding Blushhole, Understanding Modernism 2018, and After the Human, Culture, Theory, and Criticism in the 21st Century, which I think we're expecting by the end of this year. It's such a pleasure to have you, to finally have you here on the screen, Professor Boulter, and thank you for agreeing to be part of this interview immediately. I mean, it was such a wonderful thing.
Pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
So, discussing today on Samuel Beckett's Spectres and Posthuman Spaces, as I've titled it, we'll try to locate the homeless entities in Beckett's later prose works and his idea behind lessening spaces in Professor Boulter's absolutely fascinating book, Posthuman Space in Samuel Beckett's short prose. And this is also for the audience attending this session. If you have any questions, please write them down in the chat box. They will be taken up towards the end of the session. Okay, should we begin, Professor Boulter, with the questions?
I'm open to questioning.
Okay. So my first question is, you write so appropriately that the Beckettian subject bears disastrous imprints of a spatial catastrophe. So is it justified to say that Beckett attempts to spatialize the subject and subjectivize space? And if this is true, what is the motive behind such hybridization?
Let me just say, before I answer this question, I just want to say again, one more time, thank you very much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure to be here and to speak with you, Asijit. As I've told you, these questions are all fantastic, complicated questions. And this first one is a complicated question for a number of reasons. I think the short answer to all your questions is something like yes. Everything you ask is answered in the affirmative. But the difficulty with some of these questions, one of them is that they seem to assume, as is impossible not to, that there actually is a subject in place, in play in Beckett's work. So when you ask this question, is it justified to say that Beckett attempts to spatialize the subject? My immediate response is yes, because I see this spatialization happening in a variety of ways in a variety of locations. We'll discuss this. But the question also seems to, in fact, beg the question of the subject as such. And one of the things I don't want to simply problematize every question that has the word subject in it, but I think it's probably appropriate at the outset to say something like this, is that everything that I'm interested in exploring in Beckett's work, and this is true from the very beginning of my work with Beckett, has been, in fact, to interrogate the very idea of the subject in Beckett. And in a more simple way of putting this is that I'm not quite sure if the word subject, subjectivity, self, person, actually is appropriate in our discussion of Beckett's work. And to put it even more simply, I'm not sure what we're dealing with here in terms of the human, of the self in Beckett, especially after, and I guess it's actually between Malone Dies and the Unnameable. I think I'm happy to talk about the subject and subjectivity without too many problems in work up to Malloy. I think in Malloy, we have a subject that is in some senses in place. Its body is failing, we all know this, but I think there's still a human in place. And I think up until the end of Malone Dies, we have a human in place, even though it is extraordinarily disabled. Between Malone Dies and the Unnameable, as everyone knows, something occurs, and we move into the space of the Unnameable. And again, my difficulty with Beckett and my fascination with Beckett actually begins there. I don't know where we are in the Unnameable. I don't know how to locate myself. I don't know how to speak about what the entity is in the Unnameable. If it's where we are we in some sort of afterlife? I'm not happy with that idea. It's too metaphysical. Is the subject a full subject, a partial subject, an object? I'm not certain. So this is what I'm fascinated by, is that transition between Malone Dies, the Unnameable, and then of course the book, this book that we're talking about here, has to do with, you know, what Beckett calls the afterbirth of the Unnameable, that is to say, text for nothing. And as we know, and as I pointed out in the book, one of the very uncanny aspects of Text for Nothing is that, unlike the Unnameable, where I can't locate myself in a space, I don't know where we are in the Unnameable, it seems in Text for Nothing that the world has made a kind of uncanny comeback. We have heaths, we have land, we have divots in the earth, we have a world in place. And here's what really fascinates me is I think we have something approaching the subject or subjectivity of the unnameable, but placed into material space and spaces in Text for Nothing and perhaps onwards. And it's that precise dilemma that motivated this book, that very simple and perhaps simple-minded observation that we have something that Blanchot would call, and I would agree with him, the subjectivity without any subject, located in a real material world. And my problem, and again, it might be only my problem, is that I don't know how to accommodate that, whatever that thing is, to the real world. And I guess another way of asking this question would be something like this. Why would a subjectivity without any subject, let's call it for a moment some sort of spectre, why would it need a material world? And that is the question that motivated this entire book. And so back to your actual question, is it justified, you asked, to say that Beckett attempts to spatialize the subject and subjectivize space? The short answer to the question is yes. Space seems to be, how to put this, it seems to be a requirement for some sort of subjectivity to emerge. It is the grounds for this spectral subjectivity. And the way I would answer this question from a more philosophical point of view is to say that Beckett, very much like Heidegger, understands subjectivity to be always already spatialized. And as you know, because you've read my book, Heidegger is, in some senses, my major interlocutor, but also Beckett's major interlocutor. And I think there's a crossover of ideas here, and one of them being Heidegger's notion that the subject is a spatialized subject, as he says in Being in Time. So my real interest is to find ways of understanding what a spectre needs in the world and what the world does to allow us to understand what Beckett is doing with this curious subjectivity without any subject. Your last clause in your question is what is the motive behind this hybridization? What is the motive behind spatializing subjectivity and subjectivizing space? I'm not sure I can answer that question because I can't speak to the motives of Beckett. I can't even probably speak to the motives of Beckett's various and varied narrators. All I can say is something like this, that in Beckett there is an insistence on space being there as a ground. And I say it's an insistence, it's a persistence. I'm not certain at all that this is a positive thing for the subject. And I know I'm speaking in a long-winded way here, but I think this is probably important for me to say at the outset here. My own way of reading Beckett's work from at least Malloy onwards to Westward Ho is that I do believe that he's searching for a way discursively to end the subject. I do believe, and I know this is something of a cliche in Beckett's studies to talk about the diminution of the subject and him whittling away the subject over time, and this occurs within the prose and on stage. I know it's a cliche, but there's some truth to this. I do believe that Beckett is enormously, how to put this, burdened by subjectivity, burdened by the self, and is looking for ways of removing it. And I think perhaps there is a discovery that this removal of the self requires maybe in some senses a framework. A way to understand how to remove the subject requires a ground, as in a painting. And maybe space is that initial ground. And we see this initial ground coming into being in works like Text for Nothing and Lessness and All Strange Away. There might be ruined spaces. And there's a sort of a move towards a gradual removal of this ground. But I think my argument would be something like he can never fully remove that ground, just as he can never fully remove the subject, and the variety of ways of understanding why this is an impossibility. And we can perhaps talk about this. The first thing I'll say, perhaps to answer my own question about this, is that, and you point this out in some of your questions, you can't do away with the self or the grounds of the self as long as there's discourse. And this is a very Heideggerian notion when he says that language is the house of being. Beckett agrees with this. As soon as there is language or discourse, there's going to be a self or there's going to be being. So the question ultimately, or my fantasy question for Beckett would be something like this: how would you finally inscribe, and I'm using my words as carefully as I can here, how would you finally inscribe the end of discourse? And I think that's a logical impossibility, unless, as I tell my students when I'm teaching Malone Dies, Beckett's ultimate goal is that empty space at the empty half page at the end of Malone Dies, when his language stutters to a halt, and then you have that blank. I do in one of my editions. And I say, maybe this is perhaps Beckett's ultimate goal, is that space of nothing. Now, I know that's probably accidental, has nothing to do with Beckett's choice, but the end of discourse seems to be the goal at some level, which proves ultimately to be an impossibility. My apologies for such a long-winded response. But it's a fantastic question that leads to in so many directions.
Right. So my next question would be, so I've always understood Beckett's empty spaces as technological ruins. I think this is one of the reasons Beckett's works are such rejections of technology or machinic parts, barring perhaps Krapp's last tape, which of course, there is a spewing of Krapp of the past. So could you shed some light on this rejection of the informational material entity?
It's a tough question because I'm moderately unclear as to your idea of the technological ruin. Now, if I understand you correctly, or maybe I don't, I'll simply ask you this question. Are we speaking here, when you use the phrase technological ruin, like the ruin of spaces as in lessness, where we see ruins of buildings? Is that the kind of idea you have in mind with this phrase technological ruin?
That, and also the complete absence of it. I would say that Beckett has, transcended that world, that there was once technology and there isn't anymore. So in that manner, I think.
Yeah, no, again, it's another excellent question. And this phrase at the end of things, this notion of the informational material entity that he seems to be rejecting, that phrase is one that I use in my book to make a distinction between what I see as the version of the post-human that emerges in Beckett versus in some senses, a more conventional understanding of the post-human that we see, or in cyborg versions of the post-human that we get articulated in people like Haraway and Catherine Hayles, where the cyborg emerges as what Hayles calls this distributed consciousness. Its body has been replaced, some aspect of its subjectivity has been replaced, and there's machine confluence, that idea. My understanding of the post-human in Beckett has very little to do with this notion of the cyborg that we find in Hayles or Haraway. What I do take away from Haraway, Hayles more precisely, is this idea of dislocated cognition, where her understanding of the cyborg or the post-human is that it is a sort of a network of competing consciousnesses from material entities in this place have articulated the possibility of subjectivity here, The subject is a sort of a confluence of information technologies. It has no singular or solid only, like a single place. That idea of distributed cognition, I think, is at work in Beckett as well, but not in this cyborg version. I think we see in, especially Text for Nothing, an idea of a subject who finds himself, and he keeps saying this, I find myself here, I find myself here, but I find myself also up there looking down on myself. And so you get a spatialized metaphor of the subject observing himself from a variety of locations on a variety of perspectives. And that idea of discontinuity or distribution allows me to suggest that there is some sort of relationship to the post-human cyborg at work. How this relates to technological ruins becomes one of the questions. And again, I've already in some senses answered this, that there is, to borrow from your idea, the absence of the technological ruin is in some senses a rejection of that idea. But there is still in place ground and earth. And there is still in place a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A foundation for this distributed consciousness to emerge. And so at some level, if there is a rejection of informational technological ruins, if we can say that, they still are in place, if only in a spectral way. And so one of the things I think, if we attend very carefully to Beckett's short text, we do need to begin to make sense of the quality of spectrality at work here, because the subject becomes spectral and spectralized, just as the ground, which allows the subject to emerge, is spectralized. And so it's either a doubling of spectrality, or there is simply a groundwork of spectrality that allows another kind of spectrality to emerge that we need to be thinking about here. And again, to get back to my first response to your first question, what I need to know is, how are we to understand this subject that seems to emerge and seems to demand to emerge as a spectre, and yet, as any careful or not so careful reader of Text for Nothing, the subject is not only spectral. Just as the ground is not only spectral, there are real evidences of ruins and rocks and past histories. So we're always in this space between the spectral and the real in Beckett. And I think probably our task is to begin to think and theorize what it means to be in that space between. Because the subject and its ground is neither this nor that. It's that space of, well, Beckett, labels it perfectly. It's the space of the neither. And that space is one that I think I have yet to find the way of thinking about successfully.
Right. So subjectivity in post-human terms is formed out of body memory distributed all over the place. So does that mean that ultimately the subject is destroyed if its location is in crisis? So what I'm asking is it because location, to alter the Sartrean maxim, location precedes existence?
This, again, is a great question, a complicated question. And I like the invocation of Sacklin. I like the invocation of the existentialist phenomenological problem, because that in some senses is part of the theoretical inspiration for this work, is a phenomenological understanding of what we can say about subjectivity in here. So your second question, does this mean that the subject is destroyed if its location is in crisis? Is a hard question, because I'm uncertain if the word destroyed or destruction actually is appropriate in Beckett's world. And I'm not meaning to dodge your questions, Asijit. These are great questions. But I'm not certain if the idea of destruction operates here, because the subject, even at its most precarious, persists, insists on being. So I think this is maybe one of the agonies of Beckett's work, is this precise insistence of being persisting over space and time. So But I would immediately respond to this question about the relationship between the destruction of space or location and subjectivity by answering yes. And the inspiration behind this work, as you know, is Heidegger, and one of the most important things that Heidegger says in building dwelling thinking is that man is insofar as he dwells. Now we can debate Heidegger if we wish. I'm interested, before we do that, in just maybe taking at his word this idea that there is an intimate relationship between being and dwelling. And as you note in your questions, for Heidegger, this is not an abstraction. This is not some sort of complicated metaphor. He means this in an almost literal way, that the human finds itself and defines itself as a human precisely as it finds itself in shelter. That there is something definitional. It's almost like a definitional threshold. The dwelling defines the human as such. And perhaps it's because buildings define us by giving us roles. I am what I am because I'm in my office right now. Who knows what he's thinking? But what I am interested in is asking the question of what happens when the dwelling is in, to use your word, in crisis. I'm interested in understanding the implications of the idea of what happens to the self when the dwelling is placed into ruins. And my immediate understanding, or my immediate idea, is that something happens to the being of the self when the ruin disappears. There's something happens to the understanding of the self as a subject when the ruin comes into play. And so if man is insofar as he dwells, my obvious question is, well, what is man if he cannot dwell? This leads me in the opening chapter of this book to speak about the idea of homelessness in a literal way, but also a philosophical way. These texts like the end or the comative or the expelled, which sees images of the human being thrown out of a dwelling, wandering, maybe finding temporary dwelling, being expelled from then, finding some sort of complicated and bizarre communion with some aspect of the animal world, maybe even being rejected by that, and maybe at the end of a text like the end, finding itself dispersed into the universe. But there is, in these early texts, a trajectory towards homelessness that is important for Beckett, because I think in some ways this anticipates a larger idea of what the post-human can mean for Beckett. I think these early texts like the end and the comative and the expelled are not quite, and I know this sounds very simple-minded, but they're not quite post-human yet. They're texts that explore an aspect of what it might mean to be in that space after the human. And what precipitates the movement into that space of being after the human is this removal of the sanctity of the home or the idea of the home. And being homeless precipitates a move into losses of a fairly serious kind. Your other aspect of this question, the Sartrean motion, is it, you ask, is it because location precedes existence? This is a complicated idea. For Heidegger, location, which is equated to space, is equated to being. So that is the complicated idea, because location is existence. It's not a question of preceding existence. There's a kind of simultaneity of space, of spatiality, and location and existence. But this all, and I think Beckett is in tacit agreement with Heidegger here, something precedes this notion of existence and finding of location. And it has to do with this idea of thrownness, or Heidegger's notion of Geworfenheit, this notion of being thrown into the world that we see being almost perfectly allegorized in the expelled, or in the end, or in the comative. I'll just say this, and perhaps we can return to this idea, that the condition of being thrown into the world precedes everything. It precedes existence in some senses. It defines existence as the discovery of possibility, and it precedes the discovery of space and Heidegger's understanding of things. So if I'm being honest, what we need to do, if you read in the way I tend to read Beckett, we need to be theorizing. And I think this is an impossibility. As I'm articulating it right now, I think this is an impossibility. But we need to think through carefully what thrownness means in Beckett, what it means to come to understand oneself in the world as a subject. That's essentially what Heidegger means by thrownness. The problem I see in Beckett is that this idea of thrownness begs the question again of the subject and the human. I mean, one of the great difficulties I have with Heidegger, one of many difficulties I have with Heidegger, is that I'm fairly confident in asserting that he is a humanist, despite everything, and perhaps despite his own protestations. He assumes the subject. He assumes the human. He assumes the human in place to feel the force of Dasein. I think Beckett differs from Heidegger in a number of ways, not the least of which is that Beckett questions a priori what the subject actually is. He never assumes a groundwork and a ground of subjectivity. And this is what makes his work for me so deeply seductive, but it's also what allows me to place Beckett in a space of critiquing Heidegger. I think Beckett actually offers a critique of Heidegger's humanism in a sharp way.
Right. So referring to Blashow's subjectivity without any subject, which you repeatedly mention in your book. So you have mentioned the self's loss of the body as habitat or refuge in Beckett. So, but we paradoxically also find the self perpetually animated by the force of memory, perhaps. So on the one hand, we face a loss of the body as space, as let's say a container. On the other, there is a relocation, a readjustment of the self in a semi-concrete geographical surrounding. So the self is scattered onto space, so to say. So could you comment on this post-human negotiation, so to say?
You know, I was reading these questions that you sent to me. This is the question that confirmed in some senses the necessity for this work from my perspective, because you're articulating the problem perfectly. So there's a kind of a narcissistic pleasure in reading this question, because this is precisely the kind of question that anticipated and precipitated my own work. The anxiety that results from reading this question, however, is that I realize in some senses I've not answered this question because you're asking it. And I want to make this very clear before I attempt to answer your question, that the central problem I see, or the central node of interest for me in Beckett as articulated in my response to your first question, is precisely this question of the ecological relationship between a spectre and materiality, between a subjectivity without any subject and what appears to be the material world. And I think I'm simply waiting for someone to tell me that this is a non-question, or that I'm worrying about something that doesn't need to be worried about. But I am worried, and I literally am kept awake at night thinking about why Beckett needs his spectre to be grounded. Why is there such a requirement for this world? And it's not just an accidental world, as you know very well. In some of these closed space fictions, that world is mathematically precisely ordered. It's a grid, it's a diagram, to use his own word, within which a self or a subject is conjured in order perhaps to understand its relationship to itself, understand its relationship to its own history. Whatever the case is, there is a sharp appeal to a mathematically precisely ordered world in these closed space fictions. As we move into texts like lessness, which for me is, in some senses, the apotheosis of these, the ruined space texts, or texts like fizzles, we might be again in the space of ruins where we see the ghostly remnants of the past, of history, of human history, but it's still precisely ordered. And so the question is, and I'm just returning to my central difficulty here, is why Beckett needs that ground in order to explore the removal of the subject. Do you understand what I mean by this question? Why does he need this ground to explore the removal of the subject when the subject seems always already to almost have been removed? In some ways, I think what I'm trying to understand, or I was trying to understand, and perhaps I need to write another book on this question, is that it seems to me that the ground, that is to say the world, always threatens to reconstitute the self. And you see, my difficulty is this: I see this trajectory that I read, perhaps psychoanalytically, as an expression of a desire to remove the self. And the world, in some senses, maps and echoes and mirrors that by falling into ruin. But in some crucial concomitant way, that world is always there in support of this self that seems to want to be removed from the world. So this question of the idea, to use your image, which is an image from his short story, The End, this idea of the self being scattered at once and recollected and reconstituted at the same moment, this is my long-winded answer to your question, is that this is precisely the problem. And my honest answer is, I'm not sure why Beckett is doing this. What I do know is that it strikes me that the word post-human, and I'll be honest, for me is a placeholder term to describe this very complicated negotiation between dispersal and reconstitution. The term post-human is perfectly appropriate to me because, and I'm not playing games here, within the word, we have both aspects of afterness, of dispersal, and we have the word human, which is my fairly clumsy way of suggesting that the human never fully disappears in Beckett because it can never fully disappear in Beckett. So this is my way of thinking through this complicated relationship between dispersal and a negotiated reconstitution. Space is the ground for that. And despite or because the fact that these spaces are themselves in ruins, they still operate as a kind of groundwork. And I need to begin understanding, I need to understand what the metaphor of ground will mean here for Beckett. Because it becomes clear, and Mark Byron is doing work on this right now, the world, the earth in Beckett, it's not precisely a metaphor. It's materially real. It has an ontological claim on things. And this is the reason, I'm just gonna take a sip of water. I wanna just emphasize that this entire book that we're talking about here, or I'm talking about here, it began with me thinking one more time about this quotation from Text for Nothing, which haunts the entire book. Basically, this book is an attempt to understand what the narrator of Text for Nothing 4 means when he says this: what counts is to be in the world. The posture is immaterial so long as one is on earth. And do you understand, or I'm trying to understand, the economy and logic of that assertion? What counts is to be in the world. What in the posture he says is immaterial, and that clause is complicated, as long as one is on earth. So we have ideas of world and earth in play, and this is important, this is what counts. But what allows this idea to emerge is a subject or a subjectivity, which is in turn disappearing and is suggesting that the world and the earth and the very materiality of the world and the earth is the only thing that counts. And I know I've explained this problem already, and I'm interested to hear if other people see this as a problem. I don't know how to reconcile those drives. In some ways, if I was to put on my psychoanalytical hat, I would wonder about this. If Beckett's desire, and we see this desire perhaps kick in Malone Dives, and a desire that continues in the prose and on stage throughout his entire career, maybe on stage the apotheosis is not I, or maybe breath, and maybe the apotheosis of this is something like Wordsworth Ho, or neither. This short text that he wrote, I think, might be his most successful articulation of the post-human position. If this is the trajectory in play, the question for me would be, well, how do we account for the fact that ground and the earth and the world is always in play? If a psychoanalytical perspective, I would say something like this desire to see the removal of the self is met with a kind of anxiety formation, an anxiety reaction. That there, I think Beckett comes up against the limits and limitations of his own thinking. And maybe, if I would push this, there's a kind of trembling that occurs in the face of his idea, or in the face of his desire to remove the self, which maybe compels this assertion of ground, as if he's, how to put this, sort of gently cradling the end of the self as a sort of an ethical gesture of, well, Heidegger would call this care. As the self is being removed, I'm going to allow it to emerge in its removal. And there is a kind of, and I don't want to sound overly dramatic here, but there's a kind of gentle quality to this, to allow the dispersing self a kind of cradle of the earth, to witness it and to witness that disappearance. I think in some ways, what I'm trying to say in a simpler way, I think Beckett becomes, in some senses, let me back up and say, one could argue perhaps that Beckett becomes slightly anxious over the implications of his own ideas, anxious over the implications of his own desire to remove the self. That's my way of responding to your question.
Right, and yet Derridian ontology cannot be purely ascribed to Beckettian characters because you see the ground or the space or location too keeps vanishing, right? So evaporating like a misthought thing. So is space then nothing but a temporary stage for the self to act itself out before evanescing?
Well, in some senses, I've anticipated the question in my previous response. But I would, I think, temper your question by suggesting that I don't think space is a temporary stage for this self's dispersal. I think space is an insistent presence in everything that Beckett writes in prose. And of course, you know, materially, ontologically, it has to be there on the stage, but that's another analysis that's not for me necessarily right now. So I don't know that space is, and I'm not meaning to just dissect your question, but I don't think space is temporary. I think space is an insistent presence that never relents. It's always there. And maybe it's there, and I know I'm sounding like a humanist when I say maybe it's there as a kind of witness to the end of the self, and there's a kind of gentle quality to that witnessing. Or you can say that it is, there's a kind of an aggressive quality to the way space works, because it grounds the self, perhaps despite the self's own desires. You understand what I mean? From a Heideggerian perspective, space will always already make you human. And even if you're in this condition, this curious ontological position and condition of being this spectre, or this spectre without spirit, as I try to call it, it might be that the world or the earth will always already threaten to reconstitute you, despite your desires not to be here. So space is not, I think, temporary. It's an insistent presence. Now, the question is whether or not we can or maybe need to read that insistence in a positive or a negative way. I'm not sure these oppositions actually make much sense in Beckett. My own initial response would be to say simply this, that space is, and therefore the subject is, despite its own desires. And this condition, this insistence that space has, is there in the closed space fictions, and there in texts like Lessness or Fizzles, or in Texts for Nothing, where we have the subject moving through the real world. I don't necessarily see, let me just say this carefully, I'm not sure I see much of an ontological difference between the spaces in the closed space fictions and space in, say, Lessness, in the material world. This might sound odd and counterintuitive because it is clear from the closed space fictions that we are in, I guess, literally technologically oriented spaces. They are spaces that are created, but not natural. But if you read carefully texts like All Strange Away, you read carefully a text like Ping, which Beckett, he explicitly links to Lessness. These two texts are linked. If you read the way space operates in Ping, which is mathematically ordered, it's a room clearly with walls, but Beckett is insistent on describing these walls as being the same color, as having invisible planes. That is to say, within Ping, space doesn't operate as space because you can't perceive it as such. There's an endlessness to it. There's an endless kind of invisibility to these walls that is deliberately echoed, I think, in a text like Lessness, where we move into this so-called material real world. But as you read Lessness, the color of the sky and the color of the sand and the color of the ruins and the color of the subject are identical. And there's no differentiating between the space that comes to you on the earth and the space that comes to you in the sky. It's identical to the kind of spatialization that occurs in Ping. And within these identical spaces, you have, again, the dispersed or dispersing subject. And again, this is my long-winded way of responding to your question about the temporary quality of the stage that is space. I with respect, will say that I don't think it's temporary. I think it's permanent. And what I think, if I'm correct in this, what I think Beckett is, his strong desire is to find a way of not writing the self and not writing space. That is to say, I think his strong desire is to write the space of nothing. But as he says, as we all know, because we're all Beckettians, nothing is more real than nothing. That it's impossible, probably at some level, to inscribe the space of nothing. It's impossible to represent nothing. The closest, and I know I'm repeating myself, but the closest perhaps is The End of Malone Dies. Maybe discursively, the closest is a text like Neither, where you cannot find subjectivity because you cannot find pronouns that locate subjects within. Neither is fascinating to me, and I've written about it so many times now, precisely because it seems to be that what is happening here is motion and movement in what Paul Virilio calls trajectivity without subject. Where Blanchot talks about subjectivity without any subject, I think what neither enacts quite brilliantly is trajectivity, that is to say, motion without subject, or it's trajectivity without any traject, as Paul Virilio would probably put it.
Right. So ironically, we also have the spectral self refusing to leave the world or forget its linkages to its location, its body, or other humans, let's say. So it's as if a self-imposed curse to roam the world and tell its quasi-fictional tales. So how to understand this optimistic negation or pessimistic affirmation of the self?
Well, this again goes to my previous responses, and I think one way, what I need to do at the outset in response to this question is to, again, question, well, it's questioning my own word, it's my own term that I am deploying in this book. Because part of the problem that I encountered, or probably more accurate to say that part of the problem I chose to encounter, is this difficulty of finding the appropriate terminology within which to accommodate this idea of the subject that Beckett begins to give us after Malone dies. I'll be very clear as a Beckettian, and I know I can see at least two other fairly well-known Beckettians in the room here. I personally don't know that we have found the term to describe that entity that emerges in the unnameable. I don't think human, I don't think self, I don't think person, I don't think these words are appropriate because they're too integrated. Blanchot's notion of subjectivity without any subject is one that I've returned to in my own work probably too many times, but I'm not going to apologize for it. I think it comes as close as possible for me to describe what this thing is. We have a sense of what the subject is. We have a sense of the self. That is to say, we have subjectivity. We have those affects of what makes the subject recognizable as such, but there's no subject in place. Like, there is no self in Text for Nothing, or if there is, it's in a million places. There is no self in neither that I can find, but we have, in that prose piece, we have a clear sense of an affect of a human in place. So this term that I go to often from Blanchot, I do so because it seems to be, that comes as close to describing the quality of this self that emerges in Beckett's work. What I'm also fascinated to sort of point out, and I do in my own work about using this phrase from Blanchot, is that he's very insistent on linking it to trauma. Like, this phrase doesn't occur simply because he's entering into a dispute with Levinas, and he is, because he's very explicit. This phrase emerges in Writing of the Disaster because he says, well, Levinas uses the idea of subjectivity. Well, why don't I just talk about subjectivity without any subject? He asks himself. But he immediately says, or defines this term in his own words. This is he calls it the wounded space. Subjectivity without any subject is immediately qualified and defined by Blanchot spatially and traumatically. It's the wounded space, the hurt of the dying, as he puts it. I'm fascinated, as I try to unfold in one of the later chapters in this book, I'm fascinated by the problem of trauma in Beckett as well. And I've talked about this in a number of places in my work on Beckett over the years, and I'm not happy with it because, again, my difficulty is I don't think the word trauma is appropriate here for a number of reasons, not the least of which trauma assumes a subject. The idea of trauma only makes sense if it is related to a self that has undergone some sort of process of disruption. So it begs the question of the self. It also begs the question of history and memory being possibly linked up to the self that has undergone this process. My problem is, as I've made clear, I'm not sure that there is a self to feel this. I'm not sure there is a self who can locate himself within history, as he says or as one of the narrators says in Fizzles, he's destitute of history. So what we have here, I think we have a self that seems to have been traumatized, but we can never say what that trauma is. Beckett never tells us what this is. We have the affect of trauma without trauma. We have the affect of, and I argue this in an earlier essay, we have the affect of mourning without any subject in order to undergo that process of mourning. This is my way of trying to get to this question you're asking, and it's the question of the spectre, and probably you can anticipate my problem. The idea of spectrality also begs too many questions. The spectre assumes, in my perhaps naive way of reading that term, and I'm reading this term even as a Derridian who is no naive reader of anything, but spectrality assumes a kind of metaphysics. It seems to assume a kind of the idea of the possibility of an afterlife, and that assumes a world that it strikes me that Beckett's work critiques at so many levels. I'm not sure the idea of a ghost makes much sense in Beckett because it assumes an afterlife. Why is that a problem? Well, the idea of the afterlife assumes a life. It assumes that we're now in this space, or this self has ever lived. As any number of the narrators of Text for Nothing have said, I've given myself up for dead all over the place. I'm not alive. I've never been alive. I realize this is getting to the fundamentals, and this might be too simple for a number of people here, but I think one of the ultimate effects of Beckett's work is to call into question these fundamental oppositions between, in this case, and I realize I'm sounding very simple-minded here, but I think his texts do call into question things like the opposition between life and death. I don't think that opposition makes much sense. Life and death, living and dying, self, non-self, self-ghost, don't make any sense to me. Now, having said that, Beckett's narrators do deploy terms like phantom. Long live all our phantoms, as one of the narrators says in Text for Nothing. So the discursive or tropological presence of the spectre is in play. And so a responsible reader of Beckett who has to attend to the discourse, I think has to attend to the implications of these words, has to attend to the implication of spectrality. I think one of my clumsiest moves in this book is this phrase that I'm sort of temporarily aligned to, because it does begin to approach at least the boundary of some kind of sense, but maybe not. When I use the word spectre in Beckett, I'm using, well, the phrase I have here is spectre without spirit. And what I mean by that is I think we have the affect or the quality of ghostliness, of spectrality, of the spectre as a figure for history, the figure for loss, the figure for the past, the figure for an insistent presence, all the cliches of what a spectre is. But when I use the phrase without spirit, I'm trying to suggest that we can have all those affects and qualities without the metaphysical baggage that comes along with it. I don't think we have the possibility of thinking of the ghost, and maybe the ghost always functions within culture as an emblem of a kind of hope, a promise that this world is not the only one. There's a kind of implicit metaphysics in that. There's an implicit hope in the spectre, even in its frightening forms. That's not Beckett's world. I don't think Beckett's world is one that even contemplates the possibility of thinking of the afterlife. So spectre without spirit is my way of talking about the affect of the ghost without the metaphysics. Second way I'm trying to deploy this term is to and this again is one of these aporias, these impossible spaces that Beckett puts us in so beautifully, is that the idea of the spectre without spirit is my way of saying that if there are ghosts in Beckett, they are very material ghosts. Do you understand what I'm saying here? That the spectre is not spirit. It's physical, and that brings me, as you can tell in my own speech here, to the limits of my own language, as Wittgenstein would say. I don't know how to talk about a ghost that is physically present as a material entity. That is, for me, maybe this is one of Beckett's most precise, seductive, and complicated acts of deconstruction. By giving us a material spectrality, he's dismantled any number of oppositions and put us in a space of the unthinkable. And I think I've sort of brought myself back to the beginning of my own difficulties with these short texts. And it is the difficulty of the unthinkable, or the unnameable, I guess. I just, and I know I'm repeating myself here, I just don't know that we have the language appropriate to talk about this kind of thing. So these phrases I'm using, spectre without spirit, or borrowing subjectivity without any subject, or post-human, are all placeholders. They, in some senses, become themselves spectral because they're looking, as Derrida would say to us, to the future when someone else, perhaps here, will find the appropriate terms to talk about the very material spectrality in a world that is itself always already spectral and also material and makes very real claims. And these claims are physical because this is a geology, as Mark would put it. This is a geology. It's not even words like earth and world, which can be metaphorized and philosophized out of all sort of materiality. This is, as Mark would put it, a geology. There's a hard reality to this. And it's the relationship between the geology of spectrality, or the spectrality of geology, in which we find the emerging entity that I'm calling spectre without spirit, or the post-human. That's our precise problem. And if I am, again, to use this phrase, if I am being honest at the end of things, this book is really a minuscule, for me, I don't think it's going to be of any use to anyone else, but for me, it's that minuscule first step by which I have come to understand that I don't know how to talk about Beckett's subjects. In other words, this book for me is, and I'm not disavowing it as I would normally with my work, because I don't like any of my work. I'm not disavowing this. I am sort of recognizing as a good Heideggerian that it's asking a question. And as Heidegger tells us, questioning is the piety of thought. And I'm not trying to over-dramatize by suggesting this book is pious in any way, but it is asking a question. And if Heidegger is right about this, it's important to ask the question. And I'm not joking when I say these questions or these placeholder terms are themselves spectral, because I'm looking for someone, maybe one of my own students, will answer this question. And maybe it has been answered and I'm unaware of it, but I don't know fundamentally how to attend to Beckett's subject, because I don't know what it is.
Right. So though Beckett begins the expelled and the end with classic moments of Heideggerian thrownness and fallenness, eventually, we do discover the men moving in the opposite direction, away from all desires to establish communication with the human community at large, which you so rightly have called the uncanny lack of uncanniness. Because they are thrown out of a space, and also they cannot associate with a space. So how does Beckett's expulsion and homelessness differ from the notion of Heideggerian thrownness?
This is a complicated question. And I'm not certain that I would necessarily suggest that there is much of a difference between expulsion, homelessness, and thrownness. Except to say, if I was a good Heideggerian, and I'm a moderately good Heideggerian, I would simply have to say what I said before, that thrownness precedes everything. Thrownness precedes the idea of expulsion, and thrownness precedes the idea of homelessness. thrownness is the precondition for being. It's what allows the subject, and we can be confident that Heidegger will use this term to refer to the self. It is what allows the subject to come to some understanding of itself. Thrownness is what Heidegger talks about as the subject finding himself or herself or themselves delivered over. That's his phrase. It's delivered over to themselves. There's no whence or whither, as he puts, this is in Being in Time. They don't know where they've come from or when they've come, but they're delivered over to themselves. And this is the existentialist cliche. You're thrown into the world. You have no rule book, no guide. There's no metaphysics to tell you what to do and how to do. For Heidegger, this precondition of being thrown, discovering one's thrownness, that is what allows or compels you now to make your way into the world. And the metaphors that Heidegger deploys insistently, and especially Being in Time, are all metaphors of space. He talks about the self finding direction or directionality in the world. He talks about being or Dasein as the experience of what he calls disseverance, which is simply closing the distance between yourself and some object in the distance. It's a very material way of understanding the human. And I think part of the attraction I have to Heidegger is, yeah, the dense seduction of his writing has a kind of appeal, but when it comes down to things, there is a deeply seductive simplicity to his ideas. But that simplicity itself initiates complexity. And I don't mean to be playing games here. What I mean by that is very simple. Man is insofar as he dwells. It's a very simple idea. The human is if it has a home. And every time I offer this question to my students, they look at me puzzled, as they should. What the hell, man? You step outside of your room, step outside of your office into the outdoors, or you lose your home in a disaster. Does that mean you're no longer human? Does this mean that you're post-human? Surely Heidegger isn't saying that. And I have to say, well, he might be saying that. So let's think about that simple idea and its horrific implications, or this idea that the human is defined primarily, and maybe even primordially, as an entity that is only ever closing space between itself and something else and mapping out the world. And again, I present this idea to my students and they initially think, well, that is a bit simple. But in its simplicity, there's a kind of truth to this, because this is all we do. All I did this morning was get up, go down to the kitchen, close that difference, make my coffee, get in my car, close the distance between my home and my office, pace up and down my office waiting for this interview to begin. My entire day is spatialized. My entire day is an experience of disseverance. So Heidegger will suggest this, that thrownness is a precondition for discovering what the human is. Beckett steps into this condition and offers to us several, a multiplicity of images of expulsion and homelessness, and then asks the question that I think these early texts like the End or the Commentative ask. And it's a simple, but it's a very serious question for Beckett, but also for us. And I think his question is a very ethical one. What exactly is a human without a home? And I know the immediate response, we just say, well, it's the homeless, but that's a useless term ontologically. Beckett, I think, wants to know both ontologically and ethically how we are to think of the entity without a home. The entity that becomes, and I'm trying not to oversimplify here, but there is this trajectory. The entity, because homeless, now is defined only as that thing which is finding direction. You understand? But it's not quite direction, because it's a kind of chaotic, random wandering. It's not quite directionality. You understand? There is motion but there's no purpose. And so this is another way that I think Beckett offers a critique of Heidegger. Heidegger seems to be quite reductive in the sense that he thinks of directionality and disseverance as defining the human, but he never speaks about those moments where motion and walking is without purpose or deliberately compelled upon the subject, as in the case of Beckett's subjects, where they're forced to wander, they're forced into that state of being the vagabond, as it were, the wanderer. Beckett wants to know what it means to be in that, I think he wants to know what it means to be in that space of directionality. Again, I'm not playing games here, but directionality without direction. Right? It's the same thing as the homeless figure. And I think, as I'm trying to argue in this book, that experience of being without the home, that is to say, literally without the home, is a precondition for entering in to that condition of the vagabond that we see throughout Text for Nothing, that we see again in Fizzles, and that we might actually see in a text like Neither. Neither is a text all about motion and all about moving between spaces that seem at first to welcome and then to close off that welcome, to place you always in that space of the neither here nor there. And that space, as Beckett is fond of this image of the space of the door that opens and closes, that space that is not actually a motion anywhere. This is the condition of homelessness that we find in Beckett. I will say, and I'm not sure how much time we have left here, but I want to say just one more thing about Heidegger and this idea of thrownness, because it's very often in scholars, maybe literary scholars, who deploy Heidegger and his terms as a kind of seductive ease with these terms that I have acquiesced to. But there's a moment in Being in Time where he writes something that is deeply fascinating but also troubling, where he's in the process of talking about thrownness, but he sort of stops himself and says this. He writes, Dasein, that is to say being or being there. It's actually a spatial metaphor for being, but that's neither here nor there at this moment. Dasein, he writes, remains in the throw. And this idea there are several uncanny tremblings in Being in Time, where I think Heidegger signals maybe that he might be something like a crypto post-humanist. Like he's not, I don't think Heidegger necessarily is fully convinced that the subject is this Renaissance humanist model of the subject is transparent to itself, knows itself, thinks, and therefore is all the cliches. His idea that Dasein, that is to say being, remains in the throw, means, if we attend to this sentence metaphorically as good literary scholars, the metaphor implies that thrownness has yet to occur. That we are, and I don't even know what the appropriate image is here of something throwing us into the world. I don't know if we're still in the hand that is throwing or we're here in the process of falling into the world. I'm not sure how to parse this metaphor properly. What I do understand here is that it might be that Heidegger, if only in this one sentence, is suggesting that being really is only ever a form of becoming. Like Dasein remaining in the throw means it has yet to fall into the world. It has yet to find the process of discovering itself. It might be that there's a kind of embryonic quality to Dasein or subjectivity. And I'm curious as to why he offers this and then backs away from it immediately. What, of course, intrigues me as a Beckettian is this idea of being as becoming makes perfect sense of a lot of our narrators and a lot of our narrative positions where they're neither here nor there. Like, I think a text like Neither is the perfect literary discursive analogy to this idea of Dasein remaining in the throw, in that liminal space of the neither. And I wonder if Heidegger actually is offering us a way of thinking carefully about what the Beckettian subject is, which is always in the space of motion, of the traject, of trajectivity without end. And that it's sort of a radicalized notion of liminality, because there is no possible way of conceiving an end to the liminal. The liminal stage, as Victor Turner tells us, is always ritualized. It's as a narrative with a beginning and an end. Beckett's liminal phase or space is without beginning and end. It's an always already process of being in the world without sign, without signposts, but always already being grounded as this space of the neither.
Right. So if we go to the Latin origin of the term posthumus, it would mean after ground. Humus is ground in Latin. So in the second chapter, you write something quite intriguing. So to quote you, you've written, the posthuman subject is always already a subject in mourning. And you have elaborated that the nostalgia is for lost spaces and lost communities. But I find myself in a deadlock here, actually. So we know that it is mourning of. The mourning is of the afterness of the loss of ground. It has lost ground and it's mourning. But however, how do we analyze their propensity towards compulsory solitude, death, and their ease with animals and environment rather than closed rooms?
And if I understand you correctly here, Asijit, are you suggesting that, and I think you might have in mind certain of the texts, like the and, the combative, the expelled, where we do see an explicit thematizing of the relationship between the human and animals.
Right, yes.
Cows but even these animals, as the narrator says, they themselves have a kind of inhumanity. Mm-hmm. I'm not certain that these communities of animals is necessarily a balm to the solitude of the Beckettian subject, because of their inhumanity, which is a deeply amusing way of talking about animals, maybe deeply Heideggerian, I'm not even certain. But I'm wondering, given the tenor of your question, if you are understanding this movement towards the animal world or the environment, are you understanding that as sort of a movement towards mourning?
I think it's rather than a cure of the mourning, rather than a movement towards mourning. He's trying to cure himself of mourning by moving towards them, because he has just lost a community and is going towards environment, towards open spaces, not closed spaces.
Yeah, I certainly we need in some fundamental way to make sense of the subject in these early texts and texts for nothing. And I think these texts are very closely aligned, obviously, to what we might call a kind of ecological logic. And I'll just say this, and I know it's early for some people, and I hope you can find the energy to stay with us here, but the primary motive I had in writing this book was to talk at length about the idea of ecology in Beckett. I didn't begin by desiring to write another book on the posthuman. I had already at this point written a book on posthumanism and gaming, and I discovered the theory of the posthuman that interests me. My task in this book was to think about what I called the ecological subject. In my initial pitch to Stanley Gontarski, who was so kind enough to listen to the pitch, I wanted to talk about ecology, and started writing about ecology, and then very quickly came to understand, and I know by now, after speaking with you for an hour and 15 minutes, I'm making my point. The idea of ecology has a number of assumptions as well. And the idea of ecology as, on a very basic level, a notion of radical connection and a radical framework, I know there are ways of theoretically radicalizing a conservative ecology through, say, Deleuze and Guattari, and talk about rhizomes and acentering and, you know, structures without generals. We could do that easily and probably make that idea sort of a Deleuzian version of the ecological subject harmonize quite nicely with Beckett's world. I think that's something I could have done and was sort of tempted to do. But it strikes me that, and it struck me as I started writing this, that the notion of ecology, just as the notion of the place of the self and animals and environment within ecologies, it assumes, again, too many things for me. And I think one of my problems as a Beckettian is that I always go down, maybe, in this image, to the ground of things. Ecology assumes world. Ecology assumes earth. To speak about these terms of world and earth in Beckett seems at the very least problematical, not the least of which because we're in an only discursive universe. I think there's something maybe simple-minded about this problem, but let's be honest here. We are only in the realm of discourse when we're reading Beckett. To even talk about materiality in geology has to be qualified or bracketed off, as the phenomenologists would say, by asserting that this is only discursive. This is only always discursive. So what does it mean to talk about a world that is mediated to us through discourse and language that is itself always already problematized on its own grounds? That's a big problem. But I think my own difficulty is I'm not quite sure how we can begin to talk about world or earth in Beckett. And you understand, this leads me back to that moment from Text for Nothing 4. What counts is to be in the world, so long as one is on earth. He uses both of those words in the one sentence. So I am answering your question. I think what we have here in Beckett is a desire to present a version of an ecology that might offset loss. Because theoretically, an ecology would connect one to everything. And mourning is about connecting back to that lost object. And in my own deeply simple-minded way of reading Beckett, and I make this argument in my reading of The Lost Ones, I think what is lost in Beckett is precisely the idea of world. I think that is the ultimate loss. It's the loss of what world can mean. Now, this leads to another definitional problem, and it's a simple one. Well, what do we mean by world here? What does Beckett's narrator mean when he says what counts is to be in the world? So long as one is on earth, is he conflating those two words? And a Heideggerian reading that sentence, as I was when I did read them, will begin to understand that Heidegger too deploys these words. The earth, especially in the later sort of poetic stuff. But the idea of world is crucial to his book on metaphysics, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, which is also a book about solitude and ecology. We need to understand what world means for the Beckettian subject. And on a very simple way, just to answer your question, world for Heidegger means the possibility of entering into a relationship, hence it's an ecology, a relationship to other humans. And he's very simple about this. A world emerges as a subject encounters a subject in almost a Levinasian way of recognizing the face of the other. That's what Heidegger means by world. And I think that also might be one way of understanding what Beckett's narrators mean by world. Because these early texts, like the end, the expelled, the comative, are all about the subject being expelled from one world and attempting maybe to find another possible world out there. And there are these sort of trajectories of encounters with other humans and other animals, but they always seem to fail in these early texts. Text for Nothing and fizzles, the question of world becomes hugely problematical because precisely, and I'll stop answering your question right now, The idea of world in the Heideggerian sense begs the question of the subject. You understand? World means the subject encountering another subject and recognizing the subject. But in Beckett, I'm not sure we have that very groundwork possible. So again, and I know I'm making the same rhetorical move here, if we are going to talk about ecology in Beckett, it's a spectral ecology. And that idea on its own fascinates me. And it's a gift that Beckett has given us. What do we mean by a spectralized ecology? What do we mean by a spectralized world? And do these ideas of spectralized ecologies, spectralized subjects, maintain any real, can I say, ethical claims on us? Because I think ultimately Beckett is concerned with questions of ethics, because he's concerned with questions of being and persistence and the persistence of pain and suffering. These are all ethical questions. And so a spectralized ecology means a spectralized world. Does suffering and pain within that world in turn become spectralized? Is that a way of dealing with it? Is that a way of effacing it? These are the questions.
Right. So I found it very interesting how you merged narrative as a prosthetic device for the paralyzed or dying or dead narrator, and Catherine Hayles' distributed consciousness. So my question is, can the posthuman subject only survive, in Beckett of course, only survive as a narrative consciousness of cross-pollination between being and space and time?
This again is another fantastic question, and as I've explained before, my recourse to Catherine Hayles' idea of distributed cognition is a way of trying to come to some understanding of what I guess we could call the ecological model of the subject in Beckett. Ecological in the sense that it is distributed through a variety of locations and spaces. One way, and maybe we can hang our hats on this idea, there is no, in the traditional Renaissance human version of the subject, there is no single self. There's a pluralized self in competing locations and temporalities. On a very basic level, we have an ecological model of the subject in Beckett's early text for Nothing especially, because we have a self here, we have a self there, we have a self in Text for Nothing that is alive, looking down into the grave of the dead version of himself. So we have this distributed model of consciousness, because each of these locations has a subjectivity that connects, but doesn't add up to a single model of the self. So that's the idea of distributed cognition that we get in Catherine Hayles makes perfect structural sense of what possibly is emerging in Beckett's version of this. Beckett's version of this, to continue on with this idea, gets complicated as this question very nicely demonstrates, because as I said in my response to your previous question, we are only ever in the realm of discourse here. We only have access to this distributed consciousness because we have a variety of narrators narrating themselves into and out of these positions of distribution. The ecological subject in Beckett is always, and I know I'm overusing this term, but is always already a narrating subject. It's always a subject that is telling the story of its position of being the subject in a world that is in the process of disappearing. This is why I say that one of the things that I needed to do in this book was try to understand the posthuman not only as a material entity, but as a discursive entity, which leads me to this idea that maybe the appropriate phrase or term for Beckett's posthuman is always this. It's a discursive post-humanity, which I mean something, by that I mean that the posthuman subject is a narrating subject. This is made probably most explicit in the later trilogy, in Company, when you have the devised deviser, devising it all for company. The writer writing himself into the position of being his own other, in turn allowing himself to enter into the structural possibilities of a world emerging. Because if solitude is what defines a Beckettian narrator always, narrative is what allows him to pluralize himself and then to create the preconditions for what Heidegger would call world. Narrative is what allows him to enter into the space of being human, quite literally in that case. But on a very basic level, as all the Beckettians in this room understand, we have to understand the fact that these narrators are always narrating themselves into the world. It doesn't come to us. The worlds don't come to us from a discrete third-person objective view. We're always enmeshed in the language and the language problems of these various narrators. This is a discursive world. And it is one, as your question indicates, it's a world in which the subject survives. It emerges and survives within this discourse. And I don't mean to turn everything into a version of Heidegger, but Heidegger, I think, is correct in this sense. Of course, he's correct, he's Heidegger, but he's correct in the sense that language is the house of being. Beckett's narrators all, explicitly or not, confirm the truth of this. They are insofar as they speak themselves into being. Say a body where none, right? It's saying the body into being that counts. The body might not be there. Say a space or a place where there is none. It's discursive. There is probably a deep irony in all this, but at the very moment that Beckett is working to undermine his own language and discourse and its own power, as he works towards the lessness of things or the mere minimum of things, as he says in Worstward Ho, he's still supporting a world through this discourse. Again, this is the problem. The problem for Beckett is the problem of the persistent self. The problem for Beckett, therefore, also becomes the problem of the persistence of discourse and language, the persistence of narrative. And this is, of course, cliche in Beckett. It's a cliche, at least from Malloy on. All these narrators say, if only I could stop talking, if only I could stop talking. And they can't. And as soon as they speak, their world emerges into being. The task in Beckett is the task to find the silence behind everything. But that silence never emerges. Or maybe it emerges only after Beckett ultimately stops writing. You understand?
Right. So the next one is a very personal question because it has been troubling me for quite some time. So do you think it is always illness or a kind of incurable disability that propels this post-human desire to narrate and exist as and in multiple spaces?
This is a question. This is a tough question. Because it assumes in some senses, and this question of the persistence of illness and disability is a precondition for the post-human. You understand my difficulty here is that in Beckett's world, and again, this is something of a critical cliche, the idea of ability versus the idea of disability is an opposition that I think he will call into question. And I think that the overly simple way of answering your very difficult question is something like this. I'm uncertain that illness and disability are anything other but the norm in Beckett's world. The idea of ability and being free of illness and free of a body that will always already fail you is entirely foreign to the world of Beckett that I know. Which means, on a philosophical level, something sort of complicated in this sense, that if disability and illness is the only condition of this subject, I wonder if the terms themselves begin to lose their resonance. Because if everything is disability, nothing is. If everything is illness, nothing is. We need some markers of opposition to make sense of these terms. So that's my initial response to this idea is there's a philosophical problem with the discussion of disability because it is a norm. It is the way it is. It is how it is in Beckett's world, as we all know. And if that is the case, and if that is the case that the post-human follows from this, you see where I'm going. The post-human is not at any level an emergence of something interesting or new, because it is always already the Beckettian subject. And maybe this is your discovery, maybe this is my discovery as I'm speaking right now, is that the post-human doesn't emerge at the space between Malone dies and the unnameable. That Beckett's subject has always been post-human. From Murphy onwards, from Belacqua onwards. Disability and illness are the norm. And we know, if you read this biographically, illness and disability and psychological difficulty was the norm for Beckett, especially in his early life. So this is not the emergence of something new. This is simply a definition of what it means to be human. In that case, this whole book I've written is useless and meaningless. It shouldn't be post-human space in Samuel Beckett's short prose. It should be human space, because this is what it means to be human. That would be my response.
Right. I'm skipping a few questions here due to lack of time. So I find the word positionless, which you have used multiple times in the text, closely echoing the idea of spectrality, and by extension, visuals of motion, because we are looking at the spectre moving. And yet you have chosen to read it as, I quote you, radical stillness. So how could the repeatedly evicted, journeying, interim Beckettian subject ever be still?
Yeah, Asijit, this is a really great question. And it probably brings me up to you're showing the sort of the limitations of my own thinking here. Or it's bringing me to the idea that this idea of positionlessness is appropriate to certain of Beckett's narrators in certain texts. It's my way of trying to understand how to understand, as it were, what the narrator of Text for Nothing means by the phrase the infinite here, or what he means by the phrase one enormous second. Right, in those two phrases, we have space and time, I don't know, made infinite and made one. And within that sort of infinite oneness, I think the idea of positionlessness is my way of trying to understand what it would mean to be in that time where there is no time. In that space that is not really operating as space. It's that sort of boundless space that the narrator of Worstwood Ho talks about. I think what I'm trying to suggest here is that some of these narrators understand that they are, again, to use Virilio's idea, they are by nature, and I'm using my words very carefully here, they are by nature trajective. They are moving always. But that motion never leads anywhere. That motion is motion without end. And it's the fantasy that we see in play in a prose piece like Neither, or in an earlier poem, My Way is in the Sand, this idea of making a move without moving at all. And so I think positionlessness is simply my perhaps relatively awkward metaphor for the idea that movement in Beckett sometimes isn't movement. It's the affect of movement. It's the emotional quality of having moved without actually having moved. And I think we see that in a lot of these narrators. And it's also an affect that we see a great deal operating in Fizzles, which is all about motions through ruin-strewn spaces as well.
Right. So we are nearly towards the end, but this is really an interesting question, I think. I find this part really fascinating, where you mention, and I love what you have written here, that the post-human subject emerges only as a symptom of a post-human discourse. So to stretch this idea, let me ask you, according to you, is the aging Beckett, because every human is always already aging, so is the aging Beckett from the very beginning a writer writing as a writer towards death, and therefore already the presence of the post-human within the human? Or are we in the presence of Blasho here, where writing is self-effacement?
I think we are, if I'm being honest, we are in the space of both of those positions. I realize in my reading of Beckett and the trajectory of his work, I'm imposing a structure that is there in a way to help me understand this process of, it seems to be a kind of consistent paring away of the human towards some essential aspect of itself that can never fully be gone. And I realize I'm imposing a narrative that is almost a cliche in Beckett studies, this reduction of things to the end. I do believe, and I've argued this not only in this book, but in the Guide for the Perplexed, I do believe that Beckett's been a sort of post-human writer from at least the Unnameable onwards, that his task has been to remove the human from the world. And I'm very quick to say in the Guide for the Perplexed that I don't think this is a theme that is motivated in any way by a kind of cruelty or anger or violence. I think what motivates Beckett here is, or what seems to motivate Beckett here, is a desire to imagine a world without the body that brings with it all its difficulties. That is to say, all the attendant illnesses and disabilities that follow. In some ways, Beckett's work, it's complicated because he's fantasizing about the ultimate end of all of us as a way of imagining that end. And I think in some psychoanalytical way, there's a way in which that operates as a visualization process that allows us to comprehend and understand. That is to say, there's a hermeneutical quality to this that suggests, I want to understand what it means to be human. For Beckett, this seems to be answered in this way. What it means to be human is to come to terms with the fact that your body is failing you now and will forever fail you. And let's understand what that means. So on a very, and I'll say this with caution, on a very human level, there's a desire to understand the inevitability of disability. On a discursive or aesthetic level, I think Beckett also understands, and he makes this very clear in his writing, that writing, and Blanchot argues the same thing, that writing is always already a post-human act. Blanchot makes this explicitly clear. Writing is not about presence and bringing things into the world and showing in a phenomenological sense. Writing for Blanchot is always an event and performance by which the writer, the author, disappears in the field of her or his own work. And what I find fascinating and have found fascinating about Beckett forever is the conjunction of these two impulses, a very human desire to understand what it means to be human materially, and an aesthetic philosophical strand that mirrors and echoes this strand that suggests on an aesthetic level what it means to be human. In this case, to be a human writer is to perform a kind of disappearance that echoes and mirrors the very human quality of all of us. I don't want to make false equivalences by suggesting that for Beckett, the writer is the human in any sense of things, but the writer seems, in the way I understand writers, and Beckett is, for me, the apotheosis of the writer is the one who is best equipped to show us what it means to be human or post-human or the spectre without spirit. Beckett seems to have, and I know I'm romanticizing, I'm the first to admit that I'll romanticize Beckett for any number of reasons, but Beckett seems to be the perfect person to have unfolded this complicated relationship between the human and the post-human, which exists, as you'll see, as you see here, in a kind of essential simultaneity. Right? The post-human impulse in the writing is matched and met by the very human desire to understand what it means to be in the world. And that, I think there's an echo of humanism in his work, even at his most radically post-human. Even, and I know we're not going to have time to talk about this, but in his work Neither, this poem I keep referring to, I think it's his most radical offering of a post-humanism, because there is no subject in play here. But even in this piece of writing, I don't know if it's a poem or not, he has phrases that are deeply humanizing. The last phrase is unspeakable home. And unspeakability becomes for me a kind of analog of the post-human, the limits of what can be known. But the word home, which is a deeply resonant one for Beckett throughout his entire career, and for Heidegger, not incidentally, is that most human of spaces. So even in that phrase, unspeakable home, we see these tensions at work. And it's fascinating, for me at any rate, to see how these oppositions never resolve themselves. This is one of the reasons that I've been attending to Beckett's work for, I can say this now, for decades, because I cannot claim to understand the space between the very human quality of things and the radical post-human quality of things. I don't know where to situate myself. And you understand, of course, my metaphors, again, are all spatialized. I don't know where to situate myself, because Beckett himself has done something to my understanding of space or spaces. Hence the reason for writing this book and for your very generous questions.
Right. So, so taking the cue from Heidegger's notion of man as world forming, could we say that for Beckett, man is world writing? And because he's writing about a world which is ruins, disaster, and catastrophe, the narrators and the fictional figments are always already in that invisible space of the post-human.
Yeah. This goes to what I've just said, and you're dead right with this question. They are world writing, and writing is always for Beckett's. Let me qualify this. Writing can be for Beckett's narrators, especially in the second trilogy of Company, Ill-Seen, Ill-Said, and Worstward Ho, these most recalcitrant of Beckett's works, to use a geological metaphor. These are the most recalcitrant, the most difficult, for me, understanding what it means to be in this world that is as operating at the mere minimum of things, especially in Worstward Ho, the mere minimum of grammar. And we see what he has done so brilliantly. He's reduced subjectivity just as he's reduced the language that supports that subjectivity to its very end, to its nearest end point. And yet, even within this absolute crisis of being and language, there is an image of the imagining author built into this. It's as if there is a writer always situated in Beckett's world, imagining the world into being. Even, and I'll say this carefully, maybe even and especially at these moments of crisis, Beckett foregrounds a kind of witness to this process, a witness to the world that seems to be disappearing, but that disappearance is made impossible because the witness is always in place to see it. Even if the world is this world of disappearance that we get in Worstward Ho, this boundless world, even if the central figure in Ill-Seen, Ill-Said herself disappears for a time, that disappearance, that dispersal, is still being witnessed. What Beckett needed to have done, and I realize how ridiculous what I'm about to say sounds, what Beckett needed to have done is removed that witness. But I don't know what that would have entailed, unless the removal of the witness instantiates the end of writing absolutely. And that end of writing absolutely is the end of all discourse for Beckett. You understand what I'm saying? It's only Beckett's death that can instantiate this world that I perhaps am hallucinating has been his desire all along.
Right, right. And this is my last question, and I would rather end it a bit naively. So what, according to you, is the future of the post-human in Beckett? So you finish your book with Beckett's Neither, where you find subjectivity without the subject, but we're still tied to language as if it is still words and utterances which prohibit the second coming of silence. So what is the future?
Well, I think my immediate response to your question, Asijit, would be that there's no future for the post-human in Beckett because the post-human hasn't emerged yet. I don't think, and despite what we've talked about for the past 2 hours, and despite this book that's on my desk in front of me, I don't think we have understood the post-human in Beckett because I'm not certain that the post-human ever actually successfully emerges in Beckett's work. And I mean by that, what I was suggesting about an hour ago with my deployment of the term post-human, the human is still there. The human is still there as the witness to the end of things in these very late texts. The human is still there even in Text for Nothing as the writer of this condition. I think if we understand that the post-human in Beckett is the thing responsible for defining its own condition as the post-human, we come close to understanding things. But that still strikes me as an assertion of a kind of discursive power. Even and especially as these narrators all bemoan the loss of their own proper power as subjects, as selves, as narrators, still the expression of that poverty and precariousness is in place. And I know I'm repeating myself here, but this is my final question, so I'll say it one more time. As long as we have discourse in place, as long as there is language in place and in play, to use Beckett's own term, then there is the human. Even if it's only in spectral form, the human is in play. Because as you understand, as I've tried to explain, the term spectre is not appropriate to this. The word ghost is not appropriate to this. All these terms, as I've tried to suggest, are all placeholders for the emergence of some entity that is in the space between the human and what I am calling the post-human. What we need to do now is to theorize what that space between might look like. What kind of subjectivity is possible in the space between the human and the post-human, because it's not the ghost, it's not the spectre, it's something entirely other. And I'll just suggest this up front, I don't know what that is. I still don't know what Beckett has done to and with the human in his work.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Boulter, and the session is open to questions now. Can we take a few questions? We can switch on your video and ask, no need to write. Yeah, we can have a few questions.
I understand the hesitation.
Okay, if we have no questions, then we can end the session. Okay. So thank you so much, Professor Boulter, for your profound insights into the post-human condition in Beckett, the possibility of reading these texts from the Heideggerian perspective and the dynamics of space, of course. And I hope we'll have such sessions with you again in the near future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Mark. Nice to see you. Thank you, Paul Shields. Thank you all. And thank you very much, Asijit. I deeply appreciate the chance to speak about this material. It's very kind of you to ask me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. See you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.